By the end of that evening, 6 tough men struggled just to get back on their feet. The whole thing lasted 9 seconds. The door was ripped off its hinges the moment they arrived. The leader didn't hesitate. He marched straight to the nearest family table where a little girl sat wearing a paper birthday crown, a cake glowing with candles in front of her. With one sweep of his arm, everything crashed to the floor. Cake, candles, crown. Her mother pulled the child close and stayed silent. The biker's expression made it clear that any noise would only make things worse. One of his men seized a waiter by the throat, lifting him clear off the ground, while the rest moved through the dining room like they were cataloging what they planned to wreck. 40 customers sat frozen. Not one person stirred. Near the back, at a small table, a quiet man continued sitting calmly. A steaming cup of tea stood before him. He wasn't hiding or panicking. He was simply observing, as if he had already worked out how this would unfold. One of the intruders noticed him, paused, and sized him up. The man looked small, unassuming, and alone. The biker shrugged and moved on. That was his error. This crew operated on reputation. In recent weeks, they had hit a laundromat, a bar, and 2 other diners across Oakland. Every place paid up without resistance. No cops, no complaints. Just compliance. Their method was simple. Walk in, make the threat obvious, and walk out with a yes. This particular restaurant had been on their radar for 3 months. It belonged to Clint Eastwood, popular, well-placed, and always packed on Friday nights. The gang demanded regular protection money. The first month, the manager paid on schedule. The second month, it was late. This month, nothing. 2 missed payments. Tonight was the reminder. Dale Pruitt led the pack. He was a massive man whose presence alone made rooms feel smaller. People instinctively shrank and went quiet when he entered. He didn't need to shout. The 5 large men behind him delivered the message clearly. What Pruitt didn't know was that word about his crew had already spread. People had heard about the diner on Telegraph Avenue a few weeks earlier. Smashed windows, 1 employee badly hurt. The owner there had paid 3 months upfront afterward. That fear had been sitting quietly in this restaurant for weeks, waiting for this exact moment. Pruitt strolled through the center of the room without hurry. He stopped at one table, picked up a man's water glass, and gently placed it on the floor. The customer stayed silent, hands flat on the table. Another biker yanked a chair from a young couple, spun it around, and sat backward, arms crossed, staring at them. They didn't move. A young waitress, maybe 22, stood frozen near the kitchen holding a coffee pot she had been pouring when the door flew open. She thought about the back exit, but never took a step. Pruitt returned to the birthday table. The little girl had stopped crying. She and her mother stared at the wall, avoiding eye contact. He scanned the room. Everything was perfectly still. Then his gaze returned to the man at the back. The small, quiet customer was still watching him with calm, steady eyes. No fear, no challenge, just patient awareness. Pruitt waited for the usual signs of submission. They never came. He almost spoke, then dismissed it. Just a small man, he thought. Nothing to worry about. At that moment, the quiet man at the back table set down his teacup with deliberate care. The soft clink of porcelain against the saucer seemed unusually loud in the heavy silence of the room. He reached for the simple white napkin resting in his lap, folded it once with precise movements, and placed it neatly beside the cup. Every gesture was unhurried, almost ritualistic, as if he were concluding one small chapter of his evening before beginning another. A woman seated 2 tables away found her eyes drawn to him despite the terror gripping the entire restaurant. In the midst of fear that had paralyzed 40 people, this small act of folding a napkin stood out. There was something grounding about it, something that suggested control when everything else felt chaotic. She couldn't explain why, but for the first time since the door had been torn from its hinges, a tiny spark of hope flickered in her chest. The man rose from his chair. No dramatic scrape of wood against tile, no theatrical clearing of his throat. He simply stood, and the atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. It was as if an invisible pressure had changed, like the air before a storm suddenly alters course. Years later, that same woman would struggle to describe it. When he stood up, the whole room changed direction. That's the only way I can put it. The young waitress near the kitchen entrance, still clutching the coffee pot, felt her shoulders relax just a fraction. She exhaled slowly, not fully understanding why one man's decision to stand had eased the crushing weight on her chest. The biker who had been watching her turned his head slightly toward the back of the room and saw the small figure now upright. Even he sensed something had changed. Dale Pruitt felt it too. He turned around slowly, his massive frame pivoting with the confidence of a man who had dominated countless rooms just like this one. The small man stood about 15 feet away, hands relaxed at his sides, posture open and calm. He wasn't in any obvious fighting stance. He simply stood there like someone who had reached a quiet conclusion and was waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. One of Pruitt's crew members near the shattered doorway let out a low, mocking laugh. It was the kind of sound that carried both amusement and a challenge directed at their leader. Are you really going to waste time on this guy? Pruitt didn't join in the laughter. Something about the stillness radiating from the man in front of him felt subtly wrong. He had spent years learning to read people, to gauge their fear thresholds, their breaking points, the exact moment when defiance would crumble into submission. This man didn't fit any of the usual patterns. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't trembling. He wasn't even avoiding eye contact. His gaze was steady, patient, undisturbed, as though the chaos unfolding around him was merely a temporary distraction from his thoughts. Pruitt took one deliberate step forward. Then the man spoke. "Take your men and leave." 6 simple words, delivered in a calm, even tone without any trace of anger, fear, or performance. It wasn't a plea or a threat. It was a statement that seemed to close the conversation before it had truly begun. The entire restaurant fell into an even deeper silence. Even Pruitt's crew stopped their restless movements. For a long moment, everyone waited. Pruitt held the man's gaze, then a wide, unhurried smile spread across his face, the kind of smile meant to show everyone just how ridiculous this situation was. He turned toward his men, sharing the absurdity, inviting them to laugh along at the sheer nerve of this lone, small figure daring to speak up. 2 of the bikers chuckled. Another shook his head slowly in disbelief. Pruitt turned back. "Or what?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. The small man, Bruce, didn't respond. He simply waited, hands still relaxed, eyes steady. The smile remained on Pruitt's face, but something flickered behind his eyes. He had asked that question many times before, and the silence that usually followed was always the silence of defeat. This silence felt different, deeper, more certain. He pushed the uneasy feeling aside. Pruitt began walking forward again, slow and measured steps designed to let the tension build. Each footfall was intentional, giving his opponent time to feel the approaching reality. 5 feet. 4 feet. He stopped, glanced back at his crew once more to share the moment, then turned around and swung with powerful force. What happened in the next 9 seconds would be debated for years by those who witnessed it. No 2 accounts matched perfectly. The man seated 2 tables away, who had watched without blinking, later said it felt like trying to follow something on fast forward. "I saw the punch start, then Pruitt was on the floor. Everything in between was a blur." The young waitress focused on one tiny detail. Bruce's right hand made a small, precise movement in the half-second before Pruitt's arm fully extended. It was as if he already knew exactly where the blow was going and simply wasn't there when it arrived. The older man, whose water glass still sat on the floor, insisted he barely saw any hand movement at all. He said Bruce simply stepped forward into the swing rather than away from it. That single step contained everything. The first 3 seconds remained a mystery to most, but the following 6 seconds were clearer in everyone's memory. The moment Pruitt hit the floor, the other 4 crew members charged from different directions. It was a coordinated rush, the kind that had ended confrontations instantly in the past. Against any ordinary person, it would have been overwhelming. Here, it wasn't enough. Movements too fast to fully track, precise shifts in balance, controlled power delivered with economy. One by one, the large men found themselves on the ground, not shattered or unconscious, but decisively finished. Each lay in a position that made getting up again feel like a serious decision requiring careful consideration. Pruitt was on his back near the center of the room, one hand pressed against the cold floor, breathing steadily. The restaurant remained completely silent. No one cheered. No one gasped. The tension that had built for minutes broke apart in an instant, leaving behind a stunned quiet. Bruce turned without ceremony and walked back to his table. He sat down, picked up his cup of tea, still warm, and took a sip. In a voice quiet enough that only those nearby might have heard, he said, "You had your warning." It wasn't spoken to the room or to the defeated men. It was simply a statement, like closing a door that had been left open too long. Pruitt lay there for what felt like a long time, staring at the ceiling lights, the cold floor pressed against his back. He gradually became aware of his crew members scattered around him, 4 nearby, 1 against the far wall. None were standing. He turned his head slowly toward the back table. The small man was already drinking his tea again, not watching them, not gloating, just continuing his evening as if the last 60 seconds had been nothing more than a minor interruption. Pruitt had lost fights before, maybe 2 or 3 times in 20 years. Each time there had been a clear reason he could identify afterward. Someone bigger, someone faster, or a mistake he could learn from. This time, there was no such logic. He had thrown the first punch. He had been the one advancing. He had 6 men with him, yet he had been on the floor before he even understood he was falling. Slowly, painfully aware of the watching eyes, Pruitt got to his feet. His crew followed one by one, moving with whatever dignity they could still manage. Which wasn't much. They avoided looking at each other. The sounds of the restaurant, clinking plates, murmurs, normal life, had not returned. There was only the quiet shuffle of 6 large men making their way toward the open doorframe. The little girl at the birthday table watched them leave. Her paper crown was gone, and her cake was ruined on the floor, but she no longer hid against her mother. She simply watched. Her mother, arms still wrapped protectively around her daughter, had finally moved her gaze from the wall to the man quietly sipping tea at the back table. 5. She didn't speak. She just looked at him for a long moment. He didn't look back. His thoughts had already moved elsewhere. Later that night, Dale Pruitt sat on the hood of his car in the dimly lit parking lot of a gas station about 4 miles away. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. His crew leaned against vehicles or sat on the curb, unusually quiet. In the past, even after rough nights, there had always been noise. Loud arguments, excuses, someone replaying every detail to shift blame. Tonight, the silence felt heavy, almost suffocating. The only sound was the occasional flick of a lighter as one man lit a cigarette, the orange glow briefly illuminating his tired face. Pruitt kept replaying the evening in his mind, but not the 9 seconds of the fight itself. Those remained a confusing blur no matter how many times he tried to reconstruct them. Instead, his thoughts kept returning to the earlier moment. The instant the small man had stood up from his table. Across the crowded room, Pruitt had looked at him and seen nothing outwardly threatening. No weapons, no aggressive posture, no backup. Just a lean, unassuming figure with a cup of tea. Yet something deep in his instincts had stirred, a warning signal he hadn't felt in years, and he had ignored it. He had walked forward anyway. He had smiled at his crew. He had closed the distance. That decision haunted him more than the loss. Pruitt had built his reputation on reading rooms and people accurately. Tonight, he had been right about every single person in that restaurant. The frozen customers, the terrified staff, the family at the birthday table. Everyone had behaved exactly as expected, except one. He didn't go back. He didn't send anyone else either. That was the first real change. The story of what happened began spreading through Oakland almost immediately, the way such tales always do. Whispered at first among those who had been present, then passed to friends, family, and coworkers. By the end of the following week, several versions were circulating. One dramatic retelling claimed the small man had taken down all 6 attackers with a single impossible movement. Another added weapons and a prolonged brawl that painted Pruitt's crew in an even worse light. The version closest to reality was also the quietest. A lone man stood up, spoke 6 calm words, and the 6 intruders ended up on the floor in under 10 seconds. That simpler account didn't travel as widely at first because it lacked the usual flair, but it carried a deeper resonance. In a room full of people who had already surrendered to fear, One person had simply decided the situation was not yet finished. 3 weeks after that Friday night, the restaurant manager received a brief phone call. No introduction, no threats. Just a calm voice informing him that the protection payments were over. The restaurant would not be contacted again. The manager thanked the caller and hung up. He stood in his small office for a long time afterward, staring at the wall. He considered asking questions or trying to trace the call, but ultimately decided against it. Some things were better left unexplained. For Pruitt, the changes came gradually, in small, almost invisible decisions over the following months. He stopped scheduling visits to restaurants that had families inside. There was no announcement, no formal rule change. When one of his men asked why certain places were suddenly off limits, Pruitt simply replied that it wasn't worth the extra complications and left it at that. He also developed a new habit, pausing for a second or two at doorways before entering any room. Just long enough to take in the space, the people, the atmosphere. It was a small thing, barely noticeable to outsiders, but his crew eventually commented on it. "You seem different since that night," one of them said during a quiet evening. Pruitt didn't answer right away. After a pause, he replied, "You should pay more attention to a room before you walk into it." He offered no further explanation, and none was needed. He never learned the name of the man who had been sitting at the back table with his cup of tea. He never tried to find out. Whatever had been taken from him, or given to him, during those 9 seconds, Pruitt chose to carry it quietly, not as a wound or a source of shame, but as a necessary correction to how he saw the world. There was never an official record of the incident. No police report was filed. No newspaper wrote about it. The damaged door was replaced within days. The birthday cake was cleaned up. The paper crown was thrown away with the rest of the debris. On the surface, the restaurant returned to normal. But for those who had been there that night, the memory lingered. Some spoke about it for years, trying to capture not just what they saw, but what they felt. Others eventually stopped telling the story, not because they doubted it, but because the true version always sounded too quiet, too fast, and too ordinary in the retelling. It never quite conveyed the profound shift they had witnessed. The moment one unassuming person decided that fear would not have the final word. The little girl from the birthday table grew up without ever learning the identity of the man at the back. Her mother knew, or at least strongly suspected, but she never told her daughter the full story. Not because it wasn't worth sharing, but because she spent years searching for the right words and never quite found them. What happened that night wasn't a typical fight or a flashy act of heroism. It was something quieter and more powerful. One person refusing to accept that the situation was already decided. 6 men had come to break something in that restaurant. In the end, they did break something, just not what they had intended. Bruce left the restaurant the same way he had arrived, alone and without drawing further attention. He had come for a quiet dinner after a long day and simply finished his meal before heading home. The interruption, however dramatic for everyone else, had been just that, an interruption. In the years that followed, the events of that August night in 1972 took on a life of their own, quietly weaving into the fabric of Oakland's collective memory. What started as a private confrontation in a busy restaurant gradually became something larger. A story people told not just to recount a fight, but to remember a feeling. The feeling that even when everything seems inevitable, one person's decision can still alter the course. The little girl whose birthday was interrupted that evening grew into a young woman who carried the memory with her. She never knew the man's name, but she remembered the way the room changed when he stood up. As an adult, she would sometimes tell a version of the story to friends when conversations turned to courage. It wasn't loud or flashy, she'd say. It was just steady. Like he knew exactly who he was in that moment and nothing else mattered. Her mother, who had watched it all while shielding her daughter, never added many details. Some experiences, she believed, were too personal to fully explain. Dale Pruitt, meanwhile, continued his life, but the shift inside him proved permanent. He ran his crew with the same authority, but the edge had softened in subtle ways. He became more selective about targets. He listened more carefully when people spoke, and he taught the younger members who joined later to read the room before you own it. When they asked what he meant, he would only smile faintly and say, "You'll know it when you feel it." He never sought revenge or tried to track down the man from the restaurant. In a strange way, That night had given him something valuable, a reminder that strength wasn't just about size or numbers. Sometimes it was about clarity, timing, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your own capabilities without needing to prove them to anyone else. Pruitt kept that lesson close, like a scar that no longer hurt, but still taught him something every time he noticed it. Word of the incident eventually reached people far beyond the immediate neighborhood. Variations of the story traveled through martial arts circles, local bars, and family gatherings. Some versions added dramatic flourishes, flying kicks, broken tables, or heroic one-liners. Others stayed closer to the truth. What endured across all tellings was the core idea. In a room frozen by fear, one calm individual had refused to play the role assigned to him. Clint Eastwood's restaurant continued operating successfully. The manager never mentioned the incident to the owner in detail, and life moved on. The replaced door swung smoothly on new hinges. New families celebrated birthdays at the same tables. New waitstaff poured coffee without remembering the night a coffee pot had been held motionless for minutes. But every so often, an older employee would glance toward the back table where the quiet man had sat and feel a small sense of reassurance. Bruce himself never spoke publicly about that evening, at least not in any recorded way. He had come for a simple meal and left the same way, quietly, after finishing his tea. For him, it was simply another moment of responding to what was in front of him. No more, no less. Decades later, long after the original witnesses had grown old or passed on, the story still surfaced from time to time. Someone would share it at a dinner party or post a version online. Details would shift and blur with each retelling, as stories do. Yet the emotional truth remained consistent. 6 men entered a restaurant intending to dominate and destroy. They left having learned something profound about the limits of force when it meets unshakable composure. There is still no official document, police report, or newspaper archive confirming the exact events of that night. The absence of records only added to the legend. In the end, perhaps that was fitting. Some moments are too pure in their simplicity to be captured by paperwork or headlines. They exist instead in the memories of those who were there, in the way a mother held her daughter a little tighter, in the way a waitress finally set down her coffee pot, in the way a powerful man learned to pause at doorways, and in the way one small, quiet man with a cup of tea reminded everyone present that the story is never truly over until someone decides it is. And on quiet Friday nights, when the restaurant fills with the sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and birthday songs, a few of the older regulars still occasionally glance toward the back table. They don't say anything. They don't need to. The memory is enough.